Hello everyone, greetings from the 7th of Nero, AJ here, with a decidedly non-exhaustive, since there's quite a lot in the source material which looks at this, though more about said quantity in a moment, a non-exhaustive study of the many and varied public holidays, feast days, and days of remembrance, which are observed or otherwise celebrated across the nations of the Iron Kingdoms and Immoren. As to aforementioned quantity, several individual days are indicated as being the equivalent of days with some religious or secular importance, whether locally, nationally, or racially. But in most cases, not much by way of information is provided beyond cursory explanations, or even just listed without any accompanying detail at all. Consequently, with a few exceptions here and there, most notably in relation to Giving Day, a fair bit of what follows is likely non-canonical, though I like to think it's plausible at the very least. This applies especially to the elven holidays, but regular viewers must have gathered my biases with respect to the setting by now. With special thanks to Capra Ebriacus on Facebook for the idea. What more appropriate way to celebrate 1k subs than to discuss the setting's celebratory days and reasons thereof? Modest milestone, though 1k may be in comparison to many other channels, but I'll take what I can get. If there is anything to be learned when travelling the Iron Kingdoms and Immoren, it is that the regular people you encounter, the common folk, the citizen, the Creole folk, the villager, all of them will leap at any reason, even no reason at all, to gather for a night of eating, drinking and revelry. And it takes only minimal discussion with anyone from anywhere to learn that if today is not a feast day, holiday or day of remembrance for someone in Immoren, tomorrow certainly is. The sombre first, perhaps. Even before the Sundering, feast days or days of remembrance among the elves were generally quite rare, and indeed most human reckonings of our calendar list but two, associated with Nisor and Syra, perhaps unsurprisingly. The many other holidays of elven kind ceased to be observed centuries before I was born, and without referring to a history book or two, few elves can tell you when in the year those holidays fell. Now, with our gods no longer of this world, or any world we might identify, those last two feast days are vastly more for quiet remembrance than celebration, as one might expect, as we cling to the hope of some kind of restoration of the divine court before the last living elf passes away. As to the days themselves, remembrance to Nisor, Grand Crafter of the Divine Court, is given on the Midwinter's Vigil, which takes place on New Year's Day as per the Moran calendar, the first morning after the winter solstice. On this day, due to said responsibility once held by the Winter Father, elven craftsmen, smiths and metalworkers in particular, offer prayers through particularly intense industry. It is believed the product of their efforts on this day will last longer, perform its purpose better, and serve their owners loyally, so to speak. And remembrance to Syra, healer of the Divine Court, is given on the vernal equinox, which varies year to year in the elven calendar, but in the human calendar is generally accepted to be the 7th of Tempen, with the celebration itself referred to in Sheer as Spring's Approach, now called Syra's Wake after her death on Cain. In Iocen and Laotian mythology, it relates to when Syra nurtured the elven race into being, serving as Glaceus' midwife. More commonly, as the sire of spring, her feast day marks the goddess bringing life and warmth back to the earth after the winter's snow thaws. Before the Sundering, this day was at least partially joyous, during which Iocens would traditionally drink wines and eat foods made from seasonal ingredients in anticipation of the harvest to come, while also praying for Osiris' recovery. Since then, it has become a much more solemn affair, with no celebrations arranged, even among the largest elven colonies, even the one at Frostbracken. Instead, it is a day of quiet prayer, and many plant symbolic seedlings in the hope she might return. Time was, each of the Divine Court had their own feast day in a manner analogous to those of Nisor and Syra, each celebrating aspects of life and existence according to the god in question. For myself, it should be obvious why Nero's Wake, once called the Day of Anamnesis, has long held a severe stigma among the Iocens, but like many among the Dawn Guard and some of the more scholarly inclined, I observed that day, albeit very privately. A summer feast day, Nero's Wake takes place on the solstice, when daylight lasts the longest, as befits the Aesir of day. And in accordance with his role as the lawkeeper of the Divine Court, it was once customary to take that day to read about the history of the elven people, while public activities centred around trading books and attending academic classes of some sort. A centuries-lost tradition was the Nero's Holiday Lectures, when the universities of Isles would close their classrooms to regular lessons, and instead opened their doors to any citizen who wished to learn something new for the day. The other gods had similar days of observance, but one day stood apart from all these 8, and that was the Forest Home Day, which marked the founding of the Iocen nation within the Arkenbough and Mistbough forests, meant to celebrate the survival of the elven race after the cataclysm, and give thanks to the Divine Court for said survival. Forest Home fell out of favour during the Great Malaise when the Ithils of Ios grew distant from each other. During the early centuries of Ios, it was a grand affair, with much of Shir, Lios and Isira and the other Ithil capitals becoming boisterous parade grounds, spilling over with cheers, wine, sweets, and organised mischief with the city lights. Unlike us elves, who observe days for a fraction of our pantheon, and quietly at that, the dwarves actively celebrate their great fathers, who each have their own feast day, spread across the year with one occurring each month. Accompanying these feast days are the corresponding celebrations for their respective clay wives, which take place the day before, serving both as a day of preparation and a day of celebration in their own right. The clay wives also have a collective day of thanksgiving on the 2nd of Trineus, when the matriarchs of the clans of the Stone Lords make symbolic offerings to express the Rhul folk's gratitude for the clay wives' role in the creation of the Dwarven people. More generally, on this day, men give their wives, mothers and sisters tokens of appreciation, while the clanswomen congregate to participate in a special Thanksgiving service to honour the clay wives. The Great Fathers themselves also have a day on which they are celebrated collectively. Gorefall, which coincides with Nusor's wake, is the day on which dwarves celebrate the ascension of the Great Fathers from being the tyrant's Gor's slaves to becoming the gods of Rhul, while it, as the name would suggest, simultaneously marks Gor's destruction. However, not all in Rhul are Rhul folk, so the Ogren, both independent and clan-tied, may not necessarily join their dwarven neighbours in observing the feast days of the Great Fathers. Instead, the Ogren have their own days of celebration, the most notable one for the Rhulic Ogren being the Day of Rhul Coronae, signifying the time when many of the northern tribes were saved from starvation by the dwarves. In what is likely one of the most strictly observed traditions throughout Immoren, they fast for the entirety of the previous day, provided their health and responsibilities allow them to, making the feast of the day itself all the more noteworthy and warranting the accompanying thanksgiving. Though, because Ogren are typically not given to extravagance, especially the Rhulic Ogren, thanks in part due to this frugal past, the festivities tend to be quite simple, but even so, they remain very meaningful. And since a fair majority of Ogren are devout Dunians, they share no few feast days with the Trollkin, but again, their celebrations are very muted by comparison. As to said Trollkin, I must profess I have never been able to definitively identify any feast days, or rather their dates. Most Creoles enjoy a good drink-up for religious reasons and would gladly indulge every night of the year provided the champions and Creole chief are not preparing for, or actually are, at war. That said, a few days can be determined based on observances by the aforementioned Ogren, with an actual date is Shroudfall, which is, in accordance with Dunian belief, traditionally the date of Dunia's coming into being as the first presence of life on Cain, divine or otherwise. Ogren celebrate it by planting the seedlings of flowering plants, and as best as I can tell, the Trollkin do so by debating whether they should pour their beer on freshly tilled earth, or just drink it, only to invariably do the latter, before trying and failing to avoid the former, as they get progressively more drunk. Other feast days include respective creation days, on which the Ogren and Trollkin celebrate the creation of the very first of their race. The dates themselves are often a matter of lively discussion, because there do tend to be regional differences, if more so among the Trollkin than the Ogren. The Gobbers also observe their analogous creation day, if not necessarily the date, but care little for the significance either way. As concerns the Efarit, I regret I have not spent enough time among their culture to learn what holidays or feast days they might have, whether religious or secular. Thus I can only guess at what they might celebrate based on their beliefs and gods. As to human cultures, there is a surprising amount of overlap among the three main religions, even if they would be loath to admit it. Giving Day is perhaps the most well-known holiday in the calendars of Morrowans, Menites and Thamarites, to the extent even elves, Trollkin, Gobbers and Ogren who live among humans in the Iron Kingdoms often join in the annual festivities. Giving Day is a mostly secular holiday these days, particularly when one attends the festivals held for the occasion in large cities with Morrowan majorities. However, though it has a measure of religious influence, Giving Day as a feast day has a complicated history which stretches back as far as the Thousand Cities era, having become the culmination of several different traditions regarding how people celebrate the winter solstice, which falls on the very last day of the year, and how they welcome the new year at midnight. As one would expect, Menites, especially Sul-Menites, do not celebrate per se. Instead, they must provide a tithe to their local temple. Most attend special services and processions which feature priests, Menite officials, and warriors from the local chapters of knightly orders. Before the harrowing of the Protectorate of Menoth, these cavalcades could extend across the entire width of Immer, with companies of Flame Guard and Exemplars accompanying priests of every rank. The white, gold, and purple made quite a spectacle, so I'm told. Such activities still take place now, both in the populated remnants of the Protectorate and in Cador, though on a much lesser scale. Giving Day, as it is commonly observed now, dates back to the reign of Waldred the Diligent, who was noted for his benevolence throughout his reign, and in this he was no different. At the end of each year, he would set aside part of the sovereign's purse for the common folk, and alms for the poor in particular, which he personally helped distribute. This gradually extended to paying for hot meals to be cooked and given out to those who needed it, to go with what quickly became a tradition of gift-giving. Though he only did this in Caspia, after his death, imitators spread the tradition to the other cities of Signar, and then Ord and Lael. In a somewhat similar spirit, in large parts of Cador, Giving Day is celebrated by grand feasts where big game animals are roasted, a custom which stems from midwinter hunts conducted by the ancient Cards. Interestingly, but perhaps unsurprisingly, Morrowian and Thamorite religious feast days are a study in contrasts. Even now, with the declaration of amnesty for worshippers of all pantheons, Thamorites never openly celebrate their holy days. However, the two religions nonetheless have much in common as far as religious days of observation go. Namely, that Morrowians have Ascendance days, while Thamorites have Science days. And to the gods themselves, Morrowians have Ascension Mass, otherwise known as Morrow's Day, while Thamorites observe the irksomely named Dark Ascension. While it should be obvious what each day or group of days signifies, what's notable about Dark Ascension is Morrowian sentiment towards it. This is because they consider it a day of ill luck, and most superstitious Morrowians will only leave their homes for the least amount of time permissible by their jobs and society, under the belief they will be afflicted by misfortune, lethal and otherwise, more on this day than any other. Menites, Sul-Menite in particular, have their own religious festivals, the most notable of which is Sul-Ansvar, which commemorates the founding of the Protectorate and the first hierarch's ambitions which led to this event. Sul-Ansvar, alongside the respective memorial dates for each of the hierarchs, especially that of Garrick Voyle, is naturally not seen in any particularly good light in neighbouring Signar, especially Caspia. On a strictly secular level, a common local holiday is Founding Day, which is a fixture in nearly every settlement across the Iron Kingdoms. Naturally, the date varies depending on where one finds themselves, but certainly every major city has an official founding day on which a grand festival takes place. What activities it includes will differ, but more often than not, there's a sporting competition of some sort, whether it be boxing, wrestling, fencing, strength games, target shooting by pistol, rifle, bow or crossbow, or even just a simple race across a range of distances. Specific to Cador are a series of locally observed remembrance days dotted throughout the year dedicated to numerous heroes of the motherland. Most are working holidays, but all of them except one are held in memory of an individual or a unit who has been lauded by the High Command and the Empress, most locally born or raised, with a few who are considered heroes empire-wide. The exception is the general day of remembrance of Cadorans who died during war or in battle in service to the country. Unlike the others, it is a rest day, marked by grand parades of serving soldiers who march past local war memorials in formation with warjacks, cavalry in full ceremonial armour, and other mechanical hardware. Though not exclusively human, little is truly known about Devourer worship, at least with respect to formalised celebrations. Like Trollkin festivities, it's been difficult trying to pin down particular dates which relate to certain occasions, though with the added wrinkle that Devourer cults do not really acknowledge the concept of holiday in either of its meanings, or the concept of calendar. For the longest time, the only known cycle of feasts I knew of was the informally called Night of Transformation, once each month when Calder is full. It is not so much a recognised feast day as a regular indulgence by all the communities of wolves when the new or inexperienced among them involuntarily take on their wolfen forms and join their peers on semi-ritual hunts to embrace their primal nature. This culminates in Warp Night and Worm's Glare on consecutive nights, which occurs once every 3 years when the moons of Cain are aligned in a very specific manner, with Calder dominant in the night sky and the other two are as much as invisible. Also occurring once every 3 years is the Longest Night, as observed by the other cultures, though it is of special significance to all Tharn due to the meaning they attach to a full moon, much less 3 full moons. Celebrations, which last for 3 full days and are conducted by all adults and no few adolescent Tharn, are more or less an exercise in imitating the Devourer worm's endless hunt across Cain. Your imaginations should be able to fill in the details. A more recent feast day is also observed by the Tharn, though it has no name I am aware of. It celebrates the recovery of the Tharn people from the curse of the 10 Ills, with symbolic bloodletting or some other similar activity, depending on the tribe, done in honour of Morvana the Autumnblade. The day's formalities also serve to reaffirm the tribe's loyalty to the Circle Orboros. An enigmatic feast day, by comparison, which is also worth noting, if applicable to Devourer worshippers as a whole, is that which pays respect to the being known as the Lord of the Feast. Though quite what it entails and quite when it is, even the most gregarious of Devourer cultists are reticent to divulge, especially to outsiders. To the ordinary townsfolk of the Iron Kingdoms, a Devourer's religious observance is likely a laughable concept. Similarly laughable is the idea of a Crixian holiday. But let us not forget Torok, the Dragonfather, is treated as a god throughout the Crixian archipelago, and being a dragon with all the arrogance which comes with said race, it should be far from shocking that he has a number of days across the calendar for paying homage to the Dragonfather's deeds. The most well-known and regularly observed one is Blight's Eve, which supposedly represents the day on which Torok founded the Nightmare Empire by securing the loyalty of the pirate kings and transformed them into Lich Lords. Another theory, which may or may not be just as likely, I have no inclination for confirming the truth of it either way, is that it instead marks the conflagration of the Atramentus, and when Captain Rengrave became the first so-called citizen under Torok. In any event, the day comes with extra looting and pillaging by the Nightmare Empire's pirate fleets, followed by the Lich Lords unleashing their favoured pressgangers to replenish their ranks, whether living or undead, since one works just as well as the other in that place. Finally, the Skorne have a curious relationship with days of celebration. They are the only race among whom there are literally hundreds of days of remembrance, but which are only observed by a limited group of people. Like the other peoples of Immoren, they have a few feast days which are common across the whole empire. The most important ones, and indeed most Skorne feast days, are days of significant exaltations. The exaltation of Ixoris is perhaps the one day which the Skorne Empire in its entirety makes some symbolic gesture for. The Day of the Paingivers and the Day of the Annihilators, which celebrate the contributions to Skorne culture made by Voskun and Morkarsh, respectively, are more important among their respective cults than among the general Skorne, though they may be nominally celebrated across all tours. As to the other more local days of remembrance, the vast majority tend to be somewhat transitory, observed for a generation or two before fading from memory, or perhaps longer depending on the will of the ruling tyrant or dominor and the popularity of the individual the day commemorates. Virtually all exaltations of senior Skorne nobles, especially ruling individuals, are accorded a feast day of sorts, but these are only acknowledged by the domain over which they ruled. Thus, for example, the exaltation of Octesh is only observed by House Balash, and to a lesser extent their vassals and allies, so it would be strange for someone from a political rival house to pay their respects on this day. With reference to such nobles as Octesh, given enough fame and glory to their name, it becomes likely for their exaltation to be observed on a more long-term basis, with only a very small number of individuals acquiring a permanent fixture in the Skorne calendar. Thus, it can be easily seen that the Immorese enjoy many a feast day, and in many places, life even comes with expectation of several such days throughout the year. Yet, I believe remembrance and celebration will not be in short supply in the near future, for there will be plenty of reason for one, and plenty of need for the other.